More in Common, an initiative launched in the wake of the murder of MP Jo Cox, have published a report helping to douse the flames of the culture wars today. The report focuses on political ideologies and differences and freedom of speech within the UK. It found that Britons are more than twice as likely to prioritise protecting free speech over stopping offensive speech through regulation.
Yes, and also 79% of Brits also thought that people are too easily offended these days. So it begs the question where this leaves the prospect of rigorous national debate. And we're pleased to be joined this morning by one of the authors of the report, Luke Trill. Thank you for joining us. A really interesting report, touches on a lot of sort of what we seem to discuss a lot nowadays, which is sort of culture wars and culture divides and national conversation and free speech and things like that. You know, what were the top line findings in terms of how Brits view national debate?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me to talk about it. The really interesting thing from our point of view was we were looking at these so-called culture wars, flashpoint issues, which dominate so much of the media these days. And what was really interesting was the extent to which British people strive for nuance and balance when it comes to these issues. Very rarely do they fall down very strongly on one side or the other of these quite, hot topic, controversial debates. So, as you pointed out in your opening, when it comes to something like free speech, Britons are very likely to say that free speech needs to be protected. They're worried that people are too easily offended nowadays. But they also think that when it comes to hate speech, we should be taking action. We should be taking action against those who promote intolerance against others. So Britons are really seeking balance on these issues. And what they're telling us, and what they told us in conversations right around the country, was that they think that Britain's leaders are actually making these debates harder rather than easier. They're reaching for sound bites and rhetorical grenades rather than trying to find a middle path through on issues like statues and our colonial legacy, or issues like trans rights. People are pulling at the extremes and actually leaving the British public slightly exhausted and desperate for leadership somewhere in the middle.
In the report, when it comes to statues, that 66% of Britons are proud of our history and would like to see it not only promoted but also contextualised and be able to learn from it, but without cowering away from it. How do we transform that sort of pride in what is a remarkable national story into policy terms without alighting these two very fraught sides of the debate?
Absolutely. When it came to things like colonial era statues, the British public recognised that actually, what happened in the past isn't necessarily appropriate for us to be celebrating today. But they want us to have a discussion about how we acknowledge that complexity and nuance in the past. So, for instance, the Britons that we spoke to were broadly supportive of something like the National Trust is doing around retain and explain, where they're not pulling things down or changing things, but they are contextualising. They were much less comfortable when it came to protesters pulling down statues without that conversation and discussion. And that desire to have the space to talk about these issues really came through. As you say, Britons are really proud of our history, but they're also really proud of some of the changes that we've made to become a more open and tolerant country. It was really striking in our focus groups that even quite staunch conservatives talked about gay rights as an area that they were actually quite proud of, and how the country had changed a lot in a very short space of time. And we think there are some lessons for the way that campaigners for gay rights pitch their message. Things like equal marriage building on the institution rather than tearing it down, to help us diffuse some of the culture wars today.
A huge success of the UK in particular. I wonder to what extent it really, really mattered that it was the Conservative Party that sort of pushed for this, that David Cameron spoke about, the importance of the family and expanding that institution, as you say, whereas in other countries where this is still a lot more of a contentious issue, where there is a lot more division over it, it became a more partisan issue.
Absolutely. We think that, and we've said before, that actually when culture wars seep into an issue, they basically stopped progress on it. And what campaigners for gay rights did in the UK in particular was they very deliberately avoided polarising the debate. As you say, it was a Conservative Prime Minister that introduced equal marriage. And under the Blair reforms, which is obviously a Labour government, what was really interesting was the incremental steps that campaigners took towards pushing for change. So they didn't go for marriage equality straight away. It started with civil partnerships, repeal of Section 28, then same-sex couples being able to adopt and work towards same-sex marriage. So you were able to say to some of the people who were perhaps slightly more sceptical to begin with, look, the sky hasn't fallen in, this change has benefited the country, now let's complete the journey. And we think that other campaigners can learn from that too, to build a more inclusive approach to change that lets people ask questions. You know, people spoke in our focus groups about they want to be able to sort of make mistakes and not worry about sort of too readily offending people. They want to be able to challenge, discuss, and that's how you build a consensus for change. And it's a very British way of doing it. And unfortunately, what we see is politicians on the right, politicians on the left are ignoring that British approach, the way we've always dealt with change, and are instead leaping to the extremes and driving these wedges, which, as I say, doesn't lead to progress and also is really alienating the public who are desperately looking for leadership.
Think about some of the contentious issues that we're facing today, which aren't necessarily about rights, but are about sort of immigration, for example. And we've seen, for example, this week, record numbers of illegal migrants crossing the Channel. But it's such a contentious issue, for obvious reasons. And people don't feel like they can actually express their views, particularly if they have more anti-immigration views, without being called a racist, for example. So, and my worry for these things is that the longer we don't speak about it, it will lead to a rise in sort of far-right nationalism. People, feeling that they're really not being heard by their leaders. They're not allowed to express concerns around immigration. Do you think things like that, when people feel like they have to remain quiet for fear of being called racist, those things can actually be counterproductive and lead to things, lead to more hatred, lead to more division?
Absolutely. In our focus groups, people told us that they were scared of expressing a view on lots of different issues for fear of saying the wrong thing. And that breeds resentment. So people who might be open to change actually end up sort of retreating from it and feel like elites are sort of cutting them out of the national discourse. So having that space to be able to discuss, to debate what we want from the future of our country is really important to lots of people. There is overwhelming evidence from our research and others that the British public want to see racism tackled. They want to do more to make us a fairer society. And they recognise that white people still have advantages over those from ethnic minorities. Where you start to then lose support is when you use some of the campaigning language and words around sort of white privilege and phrases like that. That doesn't resonate in the same way and leaves people feeling like they can't express a view or that their life experiences are being ignored. So again and again with Britons, it's not necessarily about how you bring about change or whether there's a debate about whether we want to be a tolerant or fair country. That's very much there. The debate is how you go about that change, how you give people space so that they don't feel shut down. Absolutely, we must take action against those who promote gratuitously offensive speech. And actually, Britain said in our poll that if someone uses that kind of speech, they're happy for them to lose their job, for them to be cancelled. But we must be careful where we set the bar for that. It shouldn't be people asking questions, challenging, wanting to express a view, and feeling like they're being dictated to.
Yeah. Well, Luke, thank you so much, Luke Trill, there, one of the co-authors of this report from More in Common. Thanks for your time.
Absolutely fascinating report. I think it could probably be summed up as Britain isn't Twitter.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I think 20% of
I think it's around 1 in 5, which is tiny, and it's the most extreme people on both sides. It's not a representative medium. But moving on.